Week 1 of the fantasy football season. Here's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking this week. Number 1, Tyreek Hill with the Miami Dolphins. So Tyreek Hill, he was my number 1 wide receiver off the board this season. This week, a great matchup versus the Jacksonville Jaguars at home for Miami, where they just put up monster points year in and year out. And once again, I think we see a big one from Hill. Number 2, Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. So St. Brown, he's been moving up the draft board year after year, and this week a great matchup. And we know it's a PPR machine. This is a good matchup. We saw a big playoff game out of him last season, and this week, once again, he's going to go out there and be a top performer. Number 3, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. So yes, he might be a little bit high on my list this week, is Justin Jefferson, but I like the matchup with the New York Giants. I know Sam Darnold is his quarterback going into the season here, most likely for the remainder of the season, unless it's an injury or if he's just that bad of a player. But Justin Jefferson, still in my opinion, overall talent and stuff, is the number 1 wide receiver in all pro football. And this week with a good matchup and a couple of these other options with tougher matchups are not 100%. That's why I him up here. Number 4, CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. So CeeDee Lamb, he pretty much held out all the training camp, got the monster contract, and well deserved after a monster few seasons in the NFL, especially last year. But this week, it's a tough matchup with the Cleveland Browns, with Denzel Ward most likely covering him in this game. And I don't think CeeDee Lamb's 100% as well. He's still got to get his legs on the room after sitting out of training camp. I know obviously he did individual practices and stuff to keep his body ready, but still, you got to be in training camp, and I believe he gets off to a little bit of a slow start. 5, A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. So this week, it could be a potential shootout in Brazil versus the Green Bay Packers. And A.J. Brown, I know he's kind of boring to people, and he's just there, but each and every season he puts up the numbers. And once again, I could see a big game from him this week. Number 6, Puka Nacua of the Los Angeles Rams. So he took the league by storm with 1,400 yards as a rookie and a 5th-round pick last year. And this is a high-powered offense. We know Sean McVay puts these playmakers in the best position they could be in his offense. And this week, Puka Nacua with a good matchup at the Detroit Lions, where he had a monster game last season versus them. I think once again, he goes out there as a good game, and I know it wasn't 100% all the training camp, but he's good to go. Number 7, Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. And Nico Collins got the big contract extension in the offseason. Him and C.J. Stroud, what a rapport these two guys had last year. I know Stephon Diggs is there, but I don't really think Diggs is going to take away from Collins. It's more Tank Dell's workload from last year that Stephon Diggs is going to take, and Noah Brown, who they cut loose and went to the Washington Commanders. So Nico Collins, a lot of people think he had one great season. It was a fluke last year, but I'm big on him this year. And I think this week in a shootout in Indianapolis, he has a good game. Number 8, Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. Jamar Chase, time of recording this, still hasn't signed a deal and ending his holdout, but I'm just putting him on the list. And if he don't play, obviously, he's not on the list of Jamar Chase. And even if he does come in and does play Chase, I don't think he's going to be 100%. Just like CeeDee Lamb, he's got to get his legs on the rim a little bit, not participating in all training camp or the preseason. But Chase, we know, is a freak wide receiver, one of the better prospects to come out in the last 5 seasons. And this week, if he does play in a pretty good matchup versus New England, I'm still tempering the expectations where he might be on a snap count. Number 9, Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. So Chris Olave, another wide receiver that people aren't that big in, but I think Chris Olave is a solid wideout. I know his quarterback, Derek Carr, is not great, but this week, a great matchup versus the Carolina Panthers, where we saw last season they couldn't stop anyone. And this week, I think Olave could have one of his better games of the season heading into opening day. Number 10, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. So this week, middle of the pack matchup for London, but just getting a quarterback upgrade overall, going obviously from Desmond Ridder and Taylor Heineke to Kirk Cousins, is a big upgrade. Drake London, we know he's a good route runner. We know he's one of the top wide receivers to come out over the last few seasons as well. And we've seen the potential. So now to play with a quarterback who's a gunslinger, has a good IQ, and gets the football down the field, London each and every week could be a top 10, top 12 option. Number 11, Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. I'm a little down on Garrett Wilson, unlike Consensus and other people who play fantasy football and the experts. I think Garrett Wilson's a good receiver, but when Aaron Rodgers, he'll definitely get a boost as Garrett Wilson compared to Zach Wilson, obviously. But I believe last year, peppered with targets was Garrett Wilson. And Aaron Rodgers, we know he's a quarterback that spreads that football out. And this week in a tougher matchup at San Francisco, I still believe he has a decent game. I'm not expecting a huge game. Number 12, Cooper Kupp of the Los Angeles Rams. So last year, definitely a down year for Cooper Kupp after a couple years ago winning the Triple Crown and was the best wide receiver in pro football. But this week, a pretty good matchup at Detroit. They're vulnerable, giving up a lot of points. Cooper Kupp's 100%. He didn't have any injuries or any setbacks in training camp. Well, last season, he was banged up going into the year. And I think this week at Detroit, he has a good performance. 13, Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. So I know Waddle, a lot of injuries in and out of ball games last season, but he still managed to have 1,000 yards. This is a high-paced offense up and down the field. They're home versus Jacksonville, where their secondary isn't all that great. And I think Jalen Waddle has a bounce-back season and a good week this week. Number 14, Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals. So he might be the most talked about and hyped up prospect in the last decade to come out of college football, and highly so. He's put up numbers his whole career. He's the son of Hall of Famer Marvin Harrison Sr. And this week at Buffalo, it's not the greatest of matchups, but Marvin Harrison, I think he's going to come into the league and take it by storm. He's got all the attributes as a number one. He's got a pretty good quarterback in Kyler Murray who likes driving that football down the field and taking chances as his gunslinger. And in a potential shootout at Buffalo with week one, Marvin Harrison, it wouldn't be surprising to me if he has a monster game. 15, Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers. So Deebo, he's a little bit down in my rankings. Obviously, if Brandon Ayuk got traded or was still holding up, he would be bumped up a little bit more. But right now, 15 with a tough matchup versus the New York Jets, where most likely Sauce Gardner will be on Deebo at least some of this ball game. And I believe it's going to be a grinded out game between both teams. I see him being decent, but nothing out of control this week. 16, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Mike Evans, 10 seasons in a row, 1,000 yards to start off a career, breaking all those records. Him and Baker Mayfield have a great rapport. This week, a pretty good matchup versus the Washington Commanders. And I think Mike Evans was a little bit underrated towards the end of preseason and into fantasy drafts, where he's a solid wide receiver too for fantasy owners. I know the upside isn't as big as some of the other wide receivers I mentioned, but Evans, he's like an A.J. Brown. He's just there. People sleep on him a little bit, but still puts up his numbers. 17, Devontae Adams of the Las Vegas Raiders. I think Adams, he's on the decline. The last couple of years, the yards per game have gone down. The numbers have gone down. And now Gardner Minshew is quarterback. I know Minshew last season, him and Michael Pittman had a good rapport, but Devontae Adams, 32 years old. Like I said, this is where the decline starts for wide receivers. And Adams this week, a pretty decent matchup at the Chargers, where I think it can move the ball a little bit, but I think his ceiling isn't that high. Number 18, DJ Moore, the Chicago Bears. So DJ Moore, what a year was for him last year with this Bear team and Justin Fields. But now with Keenan Allen added to the offense, Rome Odunze, a better running back in DeAndre Swift, I think the numbers won't be the same as last year with a lot of mouths to feed, but I still think DJ Moore is the number 2 wide receiver for fantasy owners is solid. And this week, it's not the greatest of matchups, where Tennessee's defense in the secondary has been good over the last few seasons. 19, Devon Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. So Devon Smith, we know it's going to be ball games. He gets 30, 35 fantasy points in PPR leagues. And then there's going to be games where he's only scoring 7, 10 fantasy points. But this week versus Green Bay, where they've given up a lot of big plays over the last couple of years, I think Devon Smith could go out there. He could have a good ball game. And he's a very solid number 2 wide receiver for a fantasy owners. Number 20, DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. So we'll see with a whole new offense and a new coaching staff if DK Metcalf could have a breakout season, because he's finished the last couple of years in that 20 to 22 range in points per game at the wide receiver position. So this week, not the greatest of matchups with Denver. Obviously has Patrick Surtain that's going to be covering DK Metcalf in this ball game. And Metcalf, he's another wide receiver. There's some games he'll go off and some games it'll be a low-impact type of ball game. So this week versus Denver, their defense in the secondary isn't that bad. Metcalf, he's a number 2 receiver for owners. 21, Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. So Michael Pittman last season was a good year for him. I know the touchdowns were low, and I know Anthony Richardson, who's a running quarterback that likes spreading that football out. Pittman's numbers might drop off a little bit, but this week a good matchup versus the Texans. It could be a ball game where they're trailing early and often, and they got no reason but to throw the football a whole lot. And Michael Pittman, I thought he was slept on a little bit as well in fantasy drafts. So this week, I think versus the Texans, he could go out there and be a decent option. 22, Brandon Ayuk of the San Francisco 49ers. So just like CeeDee Lamb, and if Jamar Chase ends the holdout, I think Ayuk's not going to be 100% going into this one. Has to get his legs on the rim, where he pretty much sat out all the training camp as well. until he got his contract. And it's a tough matchup versus the New York Jets with Sauce Gardner. Like I said, most likely will switch off on Debo and Brandon Ayuk, depending who goes to his side and in the slot and out wide. And I think Ayuk might be on a snap count as well a little bit. 23, Stephon Diggs of the Houston Texans. Stephon Diggs named the captain for this Houston Texan team. He's a good wide receiver, even though I think the numbers might start declining where he's getting up there in age a little bit. And he's going from Josh Allen to C.J. Stroud, even though it's not that much of a downgrade. C.J. Stroud, what a rookie season it was for him last season. And this week, indoor ball game in Indianapolis, where I expect a lot of points to be put on the board. I like Diggs as a back-end 2 option. 24, Malik Neighbors of the New York Giants. I was high on Neighbors coming into the season. The Giants have no one over there that's a threat to him. He's the number 1 option right away. If Saquon Barkley, would say, was still on the Giants, then obviously they'd be a run-first team. But now, with Singletary in the backfield and pretty much Malik Neighbors and receivers who haven't shown it in the NFL, and Wandale Robinson, Jalen Hyatt, Darius Slayton, I think Neighbors is just going to work his way into volume and making plays this season. And this week versus the middle-of-the-pack Minnesota defense, I think he's a decent option. 25, Rashod Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs. So Rice, I thought, gets suspended coming into the year, but obviously that's not the case. Hollywood Brown, he's out in this game, but it is still a tough matchup versus the Baltimore Ravens. But Rashod Rice playing with Patrick Mahomes as a flex option or a back-end 2 wide receiver is still going to put up some decent numbers. 26, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. So if Jamar Chase doesn't play in this ball game, then T. Higgins will bump up my rankings. Well, right now, like I said, time of recording this, Jamar Chase, there's been no news on him, but I'm expecting him to play in week 1 and the Bengals to cave in and give him his contract. We saw it with CeeDee Lamb. We saw it with Brandon Ayuk, and I think Chase will be in line. But T. Higgins, I think, bounces back this season. He's a big play wide receiver on the 1-year franchise tag where he wants to put in a good year and get a big contract either from the Bengals or someone else. And this week versus New England, Chase playing it or not, he's a solid option. 27, Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. So this week, not a great matchup at Kansas City. And we know he's most likely 3rd or 4th in the pecking order now is Zay Flowers. With Derrick Henry there, they're going to be a run-heavy team, I believe, on the ground. Save Lamar's running a little bit, even though I still believe Lamar's going to run when they got design plays and he has nothing going and he just puts nothing into something. And this week, Zay Flowers at Kansas City, they're going to want to try to stretch the field, but he's a low-end option. 28, Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns. So him and Deshaun Watson really haven't had a rapport over the last couple seasons. Well, we saw Cooper play great football with Joe Flacco last season towards the end of the year. Kobe Brissett as well. Cooper played 2 years ago well with this Cleveland Brown team. And this week it's a tough matchup versus former team, the Dallas Cowboys. But I still believe Cooper is a back-end 2 flex option. Could put up a decent ball game. 29, George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers. I was pretty in on him going into the season, but now Russell Wilson as the starting quarterback, I think the numbers won't be all that great. But Pickens, he's a big play wide receiver. He can make that acrobatic grab, no doubt about it. And this week in Atlanta in a ball game where it's on the fast track indoors, I think Pickens is a back-end option, could be decent. If he had a better quarterback, then I think Pickens, sky's the limit with his talent. Number 30, Keenan Allen of the Chicago Bears. A lot of people down on Keenan Allen coming into the season, and I know he came in overweight. I know he's 32 years old where wide receivers start to decline. And also there's a lot of mouths to feed. DJ Moore, Rome Odunze, they took early in the first round with the Chicago Bear team in the NFL draft. And also Caleb Williams to run the football a little bit and Swift in the backfield. But I still believe Keenan Allen is going to work his way into production as a back-end number 2 flex option because he's got good hands. He's still a good route runner. I know 20 pounds overweight coming into training camp, but Keenan Allen, he's trying to get a contract as well where he's a free agent after the season. So I believe he's going to come in and still play decent. 31, Tank Dell of the Houston Texans. I know Tank Dell, he's not the number 2 there. He's the number 3. But I still think he's going to find his way into a lot of formations and a lot of snaps as Tank Dell. When we saw last season, he broke out in his rookie year before. Unfortunately, he went down with injury with Tank Dell, where he was putting up some monster ball games. He was one of the quicker wide receivers in the league. And when you got a quarterback like C.J. Stroud, who's consistent and getting that football down the field with accuracy and putting it in the right spot, a deep ball threat like Tank Dell, it just takes 2 or 3 big plays for him to have a game. And this week in the fast track in Indianapolis, it wouldn't be surprising to me if we see one of those long 50, 60-yard touchdowns. 32, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. I know this Commander team, he might get force-fed with targets as Terry McLaurin, where there's no other options, really. If they traded for a Brandon Ayuk or got someone else in free agency, it's a different story. But Jahan Dotson traded to the Eagles. They got Luke McCaffrey, got Noah Brown there, even though he's not up to snuff with the playbook. And Terry McLaurin, if I was this Tampa Bay defense, I would just put a corner on him and a safety over the top, which they might do in this ball game. So I think his ceiling isn't high. And like I said, he's on the decline a little bit. And with the rookie quarterback Daniels, who's going to run the football a lot as well, McLaurin, he might have a down year a little bit. 33, Calvin Ridley of the Tennessee Titans. So Calvin Ridley signing the big contract in the offseason. They want him to be their number one. We know Will Levis has a big arm. And Ridley last season, I know he was inconsistent, but still finished over 1,100 yards on the season with the Jacksonville Jaguars. And this week, not a great matchup going to Soldier Field, where this bad defense has definitely improved over the last couple seasons. But like I said, Calvin Ridley, if he's got his legs on the room after he was suspended a season and played last year, maybe as the year goes on and him and Will Levis build a rapport, he could be a top 20 receiver. 34, Jaden Reed of the Green Bay Packers. I don't know who's going to be the number one over there in Green Bay. It's going to be him, Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, even Octavian Wicks. He might get 2 receiver snaps as well. So right now, Jordan Love, he got the big contract in the offseason after monster first year as a starter in the league. And Jaden Reed, 10 touchdowns. I don't see him doing it again. But this week, it's a pretty tough matchup at Philadelphia, where they definitely improved in the secondary after last season. They got torched in that secondary. But like I said, with all the factors, we don't know who's the number one. A great matchup at Philly. And this week, he's a flex option to back in wide receiver 2 option. 35, Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Chris Godwin, he still had a 1,000-yard season last year, believe it or not, for this Buccaneer team. But it was a lot of non-impact. He didn't put up a lot of fantasy points. But this season, I believe he's going to go back in the slot with new offensive coordinators, Godwin. And he's going to get easier receptions and short yardage as well, which he's done throughout his career, Chris Godwin, where he was a PPR machine before going down with an ACL injury a few years ago. But now, like I said, with him another year healthier, him going back to the slot more, I think Chris Godwin could carve out decent role and have some big games this year. And this week with a pretty decent matchup versus Washington, he's a solid flex option in the 36 and final wideout I'm ranking. He's rookie Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs, so a lot of hype going into the year about Xavier Worthy. They want him to play that Tyreek Hill type of role where he's got the same stature as Hill. Obviously, no one is Tyreek Hill in the league, but Xavier Worthy playing with a quarterback like Patrick Mahomes quickly, if he could get up to snuff with the playbook and get the trust of Mahomes, could put up big numbers this season. But this week, as a flex option or number 3 wide receiver in a pretty tough matchup versus Baltimore. It's just making the list. That's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking for week 1 of the fantasy football season.